We've all been there, trying to figure out the hassles of traveling, what time to arrive at the airport, where to board the plane, and there's no exception to the man in our story, who mistakenly boarded the wrong plane on his way to visit San Francisco. Our story brings us to a small town in Germany, where Erwin Kreitz, the main character of this story, lived. A 50-year-old man who had spent his entire life living in Germany. Erwin Kreitz was your average beer-guzzling bachelor with a dream of one day traveling the world, and he had always fantasized about one day seeing the bumpy hills of San Francisco in person. That all changed when he finally decided to buy a plane ticket and visit. All it took was one simple sentence from a flight attendant to send Kreitz's trip of a lifetime into the legendary story of today. I think it's safe to say that Erwin Kreitz was a go-with-the-flow type of guy. He had dedicated his entire life to working in a brewery, crafting the famous German beer we all know and love. Erwin was passionate about his job, as he felt more at home in a German tavern than anywhere else. But as his 50th birthday approached, Erwin decided to finally visit America, a dream he'd had as a child. Since travel websites and Google didn't exist back in 1977, all Kreitz had to go by were travel brochures and what he'd seen on TV. He had always wanted to go somewhere new, exciting, and far, far away from his homeland. As soon as he saw stunning photos of the red Golden Gate Bridge, he was hooked. And right after that, Erwin put his entire life savings into a plane ticket to San Francisco. Everything about Erwin's experience was new, from the plane trip to the sophisticated flight attendants. Even the food was different. Because of his love for beer, Erwin ordered a couple of beers during this flight, which was probably the reason why he didn't realize what was happening when the flight attendant told him to have a nice time in San Francisco. This mistake would become Erwin's new claim to fame. He grabbed his bag, said farewell to his fellow passengers, and got off the plane. Filled with anticipation of the adventures to come, Erwin went through customs and casually walked to the exit. The signs in the airport meant nothing to him because he barely spoke a word of English. Finally, Erwin stepped outside and inhaled his very first breath of American air. Kreitz let his first real view of his destination sink in. Okay, he thought. So maybe the streets weren't as hilly as he'd seen in the movies. Hollywood always exaggerated things anyway. Maybe the urban part of the city was somewhere else. With this in mind, Kreitz hopped into a cab and set off in search of a hotel. He happily looked at people and buildings as his taxi sped towards his destination. Erwin said he expected the big city to be a little, busier, but he blamed it on the fact that it was late in the evening. After dropping off his bags at the hotel, Kreitz wandered the city until he found his best friend, a tavern. He explored the unique city for 3 days. But when the beautiful Golden Gate Bridge finally came into view, Kreitz was disappointed to find it was a lot flatter and greener than he'd seen in pictures. Not to mention the people were just as distant as he expected, evidenced by the cab driver, who hurriedly sped off when Erwin asked for a lift to downtown San Francisco. He couldn't quite understand what the cab driver had grumbled, so he went back to his trusted tavern in search of a German translator. But the waitress at the tavern simply shrugged. She couldn't understand a word he said either. Luckily, the waitress knew of someone who could. Gertrude Romine, the waitress's Czechoslovakian neighbor, met up with Kreitz, and when she heard his story, she couldn't help herself but laugh at this funny situation. As Gertrude later recalled, he couldn't speak any English and didn't know. What exactly did Erwin not know? That for 3 days, the town he had been wandering around wasn't San Francisco. Nope, the sloping hills, bustling Chinese restaurants, and picturesque green bridge belonged to a different city, called Bangor in Maine. Romine's family took in Erwin out of pity, but that didn't stop his story from spreading. Before long, the funny story of the German tourist who mistook the golden tree-lined streets of New England for the hilly, diverse neighborhoods of San Francisco turned into a viral story. Erwin Kreitz became a practical celebrity overnight. By the next day, Erwin's schedule was suddenly packed with press conferences and engagements. He found himself on the Penobscot Reservation and left as an honorary member of the native tribe. Local restaurants threw a huge 50th birthday party in his honor. He shook hands with the governor of Maine, and he was even gifted with an acre of land in northern Maine. The San Francisco Examiner eventually gifted Kreitz with a free trip to San Francisco, and he was able to tour the real San Francisco. And when he finally arrived in San Francisco, he was greeted with all the glitz and glamour of a celebrity. He met with the mayor George Moscone, who presented him with a proclamation declaring that San Francisco does exist. Kreitz was showered with gifts and juggled 3 marriage proposals. While there, he was even able to visit his favorite San Francisco landmark. He happily became an honorary member of the Wong Family Association at a restaurant called Empress of China. It was the authentic San Francisco Chinese restaurant he'd been searching for. But even with all these perks, Kreitz's exceptional jet age odyssey, as Time reported, couldn't last forever. After 4 days in San Francisco, tearful crowds watched as Kreitz boarded a plane back to Germany, with a gigantic "Please let me off in Frankfurt" sign around his neck. He returned to Bangor, the city that had so embraced him, a few more times over the next few years, but it was never the same as when he first had been there. So, friends, let us know what you think about a story of a man whose entire life changed, all because of a tired flight attendant and this man's love for beer. And with that, thanks for watching. Later.